Righto, everyone. We've made it to the last music history presentation. Thanks for hanging in with me. Reminder, tomorrow on the quiz form, or on Friday, I should say, whenever you take it, that you do need to start the quiz just to fill out the verification that you watch these videos. Otherwise, the rest of the quiz is for extra credit. So, we've just scratched the surface on so many things through this, especially the 20th century. I wish we could cover more. But by the same token, this has been a good introduction, I think. We've covered a lot. So, let's dive into the last thing we're going to look at in the 20th century is just a little bit of film music. So here we go. So just a bird's eye view of the 20th century and things that would have been great to cover, but we just didn't have time. We talked about ragtime from the 1890s to the 1910s. We talked about how in the 1920s, that's when film music began as an independent form in the sense that it was no longer people just playing live music to accompany silent films. You now have talkies, which are films with recorded music and dialogue. And eventually we move on to film music that is written to evoke different moods, which we will talk a bit about today. We talked about swing and jazz and the golden era of that from the 1920s to the 50s. The 40s and 60s, this is a golden age of Broadway musicals. And today we see Broadway musicals kind of expanding their musical palette. You see hip-hop and you see rap and these kinds of things starting to merge in with Broadway, kind of shaking up the Broadway scene today. Mid-20th century, you have the rebirth of classical styles and the birth of the very avant-garde. You've got people like Cal, Babbitt, and Cage. Cage is famous for his 433, which is a song that's literally silence. You're just supposed to listen to the ambient noise for 3 movements that should last 4 minutes and 33 seconds. You have aleatoric music, which is music that is dependent on some kind of external factor, which means it's going to be different every single time you play it. All this other stuff. But then you've got people more in your classical vein. You've got Copland, one of my favorite composers from the 20th century. You've got Gershwin, you've got Shostakovich, you've got Prokofiev, all of this going on. And you have the rise of serious band music. That continues on past what Holst and what Sousa gave us. So that continues on. 50s through 70s, you've got the birth of rock and roll, and that evolves towards harder and harder rock and towards metal. But you also have a divergence of soft rock, which is kind of influenced by folk music. In the 50s, you've got the birth of soul and the evolution towards rock styles with Motown and R&B, rhythm and blues. And like I mentioned earlier, in the 70s, you've got metal in the 80s. Today, we see elements of pop and electronic dance music merging in with rock. So we've got that going on. In the 50s, you've got the beginning of the rise of country, which comes out of Western music, which we'll look at a little bit today. 70s, rap and hip-hop take off, and then the 90s, you've got electronic dance music and pop. So, anyways, that's just kind of an overview. So much that we didn't get to cover, but let's move on. So, when the first talking movie comes along in 1927, a lot of movie theater musicians lost their jobs because, you know, the music was now in the film. But this did lead to a whole new industry of score writing for Hollywood. And one of the first films to have a score specifically written to evoke emotions, you know, we did have in 1927 The Jazz Singer, which had music and spoken text recorded. But the first film to really use music to evoke emotions in a specific way was the Austrian film The Blue Angels from 1930. Then, in the 30s, you've got the rise of the Nazis in Europe, and that means a lot of European musicians leave and come to the United States. This is one of the consequences. Max Steiner was one of these immigrants from Vienna, and he gave us the music for films like Gone with the Wind, Casablanca, but his first work was King Kong, and with this film and the music he wrote, he really established the modern idea of music being fully integrated into the film. It wasn't just an element that was added on to evoke emotion or just to drown out the sound of the projector. It really was integral into the film. Very much in the vein of Wagner, who said music should be part of the drama. And he worked under these influences. He was influenced by Wagner. He came to us from Austria. And he used those leitmotifs, those small themes that relate to a character or an emotion that reoccur throughout the work. Those are now a common element in films today, but it was Steiner that first gave us those. So what I want you to do is listen into the opening main title of King Kong. This was a film that came out in 1933. So take a listen to that and hear how we've got this Wagnerian drama showing up in films. Another famous Austrian contemporary of Steiner's who also came to the United States was a guy named Erich Korngold, and I mentioned him. He was also from Vienna, just like Steiner. He immigrated to the U.S., and I mention him because he not only wrote music for Captain Blood in 1935, but another film that I know some of you are familiar with, the 1938 Adventures of Robin Hood. He was a German musician that wrote music for that. But the first American-born film composer that we need to talk about is Alfred Newman. Now, he had a brother that was also a famous film writer, and he had a nephew that I'll mention that was also a famous film writer. But we're going to talk about Alfred because he was, like I say, the first American-born film composer, and he was one of the most awarded film composers of all time. If you've ever seen the 20th a movie from 20th Century Fox, now just 20th Century Studios, the dun dun that theme, that's him. He wrote that. He also wrote music for The Diary of Anne Frank, How the West Was Won, and his last film, Airport, which actually was released, I think, a little after he died, and others. But what I want you to listen to is his main title from his 1962 score, How the West Was Won. You're going to hear these expansive brass lines that kind of resemble old hunting sounds from German Romantic music with horn calls. You're going to hear these galloping rhythms, these timbres of tambourines and other percussion that give it that Western flair, which is all inspired by the work of Aaron Copland, who's a favorite 20th century composer of mine. And you'll get a sense of what I mean if you want to listen to the optional listening, Copland's Hoedown. But what I would like you to listen to is How the West Was Won, main title by Mr. Alfred Newman here, who won the most Oscars of any film composer and was nominated for the second most. And I think you can probably guess who's been nominated for the most, but we'll get to him later. So take a listen to the main title from How the West Was Won. Now, side note, as I mentioned, Alfred Newman had a very musical family. His nephew, Randy Newman, is one you know his music by. He was a film composer, and he wrote music for 9 different Pixar films, including Toy Story. You've Got a Friend in Me? That was him. He also wrote the music for Cars, and he wrote the wonderful song Short People, which I like to hope is a metaphor, as some people suggest, but the lyrics just mock short people. Anyways, moving on. Now, let's move on to something else. Jazz in films. When you think of jazz sounds or a saxophone playing in films, what kind of scenes or moments or emotions is that supposed to evoke? What do you think of? What is that usually related to? Yeah, scenes of lust or crime, typically. And that's not necessarily directly because of the instruments, although of course jazz in its early days would have been considered a type of rebellious music, not like how rock and roll was in the 50s. And blues over time did become a bit more sultry in how it was performed, but the biggest reason is because of this dude, Alex North, who associated those sounds with scenes in his film A Streetcar Named Desire. And this was imitated by numerous crime shows over the years. I mean, even Henry Mancini's The Pink Panther theme playfully takes off of this, how if you hear a saxophone, if you hear this kind of jazz, swing style, it's either lust or crime. That's probably what's going on. So, what I'd like you to listen to is just the main title from A Streetcar Named Desire by Alex North. This is from 1951. So listen to that, and then you might understand why we have now associated the saxophone and jazz music with those kinds of scenes in movies. So take a listen. Now, remember how we mentioned that Broadway was living in its golden age in the mid-20th century? And part of this was because a lot of these musicals were also turned into films, because you could make way more money off of selling tickets to a film than you ever could selling tickets to a Broadway. That's just the reality. That's the financial reality. The Irving Berlin, you remember the guy who gave us White Christmas? and God Bless America. He also was writing musicals at this time. He wrote Annie, Get Your Gun in 1946, which was adapted into a film in 1950, which happened to a lot of Broadways. And adapted, by the way, is different from what happens today when Broadways go to film. Adapted means it was changed and restaged so it was like a musical movie. Today, what you see with a lot of Broadways that come to film is it's literally just a film of a Broadway performance. Maybe multi-camera, but that's kind of what it is. Adapted means that the scenes are totally changed, so it is a movie. Anyways, from this particular musical, Annie, Get Your Gun, we get two very well-known songs, Anything You Can Do, I Can Do Better, and There's No Business Like Show Business, which was later the title of another one of his Broadways. But the leading duo of Broadway music from this time was unquestionably Richard Rodgers, who wrote the music, and who he collaborated with frequently, Roger Hammerstein II, who wrote the lyrics. And they produced music for musicals such as Oklahoma, Carousel, South Pacific, The King and I, The Sound of Music. Oklahoma was their first, though. It was produced as a Broadway in 1943 and adapted for film in 1955. And I'd like you to listen to the main title. You're going to hear those Western sounds that we talked about earlier from Copeland. But you're going to hear something else. Main title music, which is the music that plays at the beginning, and also is when the credits roll, because credits used to roll at the beginning of films. What's been going on for a few years now, and would be standard until credits really switch to the end of the music, or the end of the film, is you're going to hear snippets of all the songs that are going to be coming up, or many of the songs that will come up throughout the film. So, go ahead and listen to the main title music from Roger and Hammerstein's 1955 musical film, Oklahoma. Now, as film music progressed in the 1970s, you start seeing something else new. Not everything's original in the films anymore. It's popular music that might already exist independently is starting to be integrated into films, and that's a tradition that carries on today. But we need to, as we wrap up our talk about film music, we cannot conclude without having mentioned one of the greatest film composers of all times. He also brought film music back into an era where lush orchestral symphonic music in the vein of Wagner finds its way back into films. And of course, the person who best exemplifies this is John Williams, who is the most nominated film composer in the history of the Academy Awards. In fact, his music for the 6 original Star Wars films, this is where music for film scores, the records of it, or the CDs or tapes or whatever it is, now begins to outsell records and recordings of just traditional classical orchestral music. So, go John. Films that John Williams has written music for. There's the Star Wars films, the Indiana Jones films, some of the Harry Potter films, the Jaws films, E.T., the film adaptation of Fiddler on the Roof, Home Alone, Tom Sawyer, the original 1970s Superman, Saving Private Ryan, Jurassic Park, and a host of other hot and not so hot hits for film and for off film. He's also written theme music for 4 different Olympics, which is amazing. It's hard to tell you what to listen to of his music because it's all so good, but I'm going to give you 2 things that I'd like you to listen to. The first one is one that less of you have probably heard, but it's one of my favorite film tunes of all time, and it's one of the tunes that won Williams an Oscar for Best Original Score, and it's the theme from his powerful World War II film, Schindler's List. This haunting tune, the theme that you're going to hear, it's kind of a leitmotif throughout the film that represents life that's on the edge of death, honestly. So, I want you to listen to that. And finally, to wrap it up, I want you to listen to one of his greatest hits of all time, and another one for which he won a Best Score Oscar, the original Star Wars main title theme. And as you listen, remember to thank Holst and Wagner for the inspiration. All right, guys, thanks so much. You made it. I'll see you another time.